Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of our series. I'm Rasoul Rahbari-Ghazani from Istanbul University, Philosophy of Religion Department. And today I have the great honor of speaking with a distinguished professor from New York City, Professor Roger Sedarat, a creative writer and thinker at English Department, Queens College, City University of New York. He is writing many very unique works combining Persian poetry with American literature, how they are put together in a very creative way. To quote the university website, his interest is putting things where they don't belong. Before I spoil it further, let's say hello to Professor, then we will see what topics we will be covering. Hello, Professor, and thank you so much for accepting this interview. We are truly honored.
Hello, Rasoul. Salam. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to your guests. I'm really excited to get to know this podcast.
I'm really, really excited and happy and honored that you accepted this invitation. Your work is truly fascinating. Today, we have very exciting topics to go through. First of all, the influence of Persian poetry on the American verse, the influence of literature poetry on academic and public domains, poetry's role in carrying over meaning, culture through performance rituals, and Professor Sedarat's own poetry. He is a poet, yes, and his academic works. Professor, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. It's hard to summarize everything, quickly, but I think over the conversation we'll get to what I'm doing, and it's much bigger than me. I think I wear many hats, as they say in America. So I am a creative poet myself, but I also trained as an Americanist scholar, so a 19th century. And how this is interesting for what we're talking about, I'm also an Iranian American. So my father is from Iran, Shiraz. My mother, she couldn't be more American, like she's a farm girl from, the
Amazing.
Illinois, you know. So you'd think it's a problem, right? I know, like in America, we talk about being half one thing, half something else. But in Iran, it's more like you're two, you're both things, And I like this model a little better with hybridity. So I didn't plan this, but I grew up with a father. He was a psychologist. He's so interested in American culture, coming from Iran. And, I wanted to learn more about my background. I since have. My wife's Iranian also. We have taken our older son to Shiraz, it's kind of like a coming back to get to know where he came from, learning the culture, but also learning the intrigue my father had with America. So unplanned, what happened to me growing up in both cultures is I fell in love with both of them. And how do you get to really know the culture, especially Iran? I don't have to tell you, through the literature, through the poetry. And I also was very interested in American poetry at the same time. So finding and studying these poets that I like so much from the United States at a really important formative time in the 19th century. They call it the American Renaissance, like Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, and especially Emerson as this foundational thinker, poet. And what I came to find out, and many people, they didn't teach me this in school, in college, but Emerson fascinated with different cultures, specifically Iran. Everybody gives him credit for being interested in India, but he was going through German sources with passion to get to the poetry of Sadi, Hafez. He was one of the very first Americanist scholars actually reading the Quran in translation, fascinated and very much with Sufi mysticism. And so they didn't teach me this in school. I'm learning, like in graduate school, I'm reading these American poets, but I'm also saying what's happening here. There's something going on, and I'm following these trails. And where it gets really interested, to talk about Emerson as, the spokesperson for American culture, it's almost like in Iran talking about Hafez, as representative of a whole nation. Like he's our national thinker in some ways, our national scholar, poet. And to think about him crossing in, well, this is how fascinated he was with Persian literature, that he called himself, as he's starting out as a writer, he called himself Sadi. When he finally discovered the biography of Sadi, he said, even before I discovered him, I feel like I know him. So there's that. And then of Hafez, he says, with his mystic vision, he says, this is a man, he sees too far, he sees throughout. This is the only man I wish to see and to be. This is the American Emerson. So I go in interest of that, and I follow that trail, and then I track it into the 20th century. And I think Persian literature and influence has been with us so long, and we haven't even been aware of it. So that became, it's a longer story, but it became my first the first real book length study of how American literature, the title of my book is, Emerson in Iran, the American appropriation of Persian culture. And it doesn't mean that appropriation can sound like a bad word, but in America, it's really not. I don't think it is in Iran either. It
No,
means
it's not.
you love these other people so much. Like
Yeah.
Hafez, there's so many people that come before him. Isn't that amazing? I want to do my own thing, but bring their work in. And that's what Emerson was doing. So I'm obsessed, like 5 years writing this book, and it got published. It's wonderful. And the biggest compliment, and you can understand as a fellow Persianist, so it did well among American scholarship, transnational studies, as we call it, and comparative. But the bigger compliment is Iranian scholars are writing me from Iran saying, yeah, we've known something about this and we're so interested. And they're teaching my book in different universities. Greatest, like, I feel like Emerson would approve, right? And I also feel like my Iranian tradition, this is what should happen with
Sure.
literature. I think it's Adi. So I'm fascinated. There's more I could talk about there. And then meanwhile, there's another story, if you don't mind my telling, with
No, please.
Whitman. Well,
We're eagerly
so,
listening.
and I can tell you one other tidbit too, for our listeners. The anecdotes, the stories fascinate me, so I want to share them. I meet my Iranian wife. She's like me. She's a hybrid. Her mother's also American. Her father's also from Shiraz. I'm
Wow.
out of college singing in like punk bands in Austin, Texas, like a cool guy that I try to be or whatever back then. I'm very young. And I meet my wife outside my job in a mailroom. And, she's like, oh, I tell her something like, you don't look like a typical Texas woman, and she's like, I'm really Iranian. And I'm like, me too. And she's like, no, you're not. And I had this necklace my aunt had given me, crazy. So it turns out her uncle had gone to elementary school with my father's older brother in Shiraz. Like they grew up together. Amazing. And then one of her uncles, Mr. Emdad, he passed away. He became the president of Shiraz University, very famous scholar, very scholar and poet himself. So I went to Shiraz and I'm getting to know him, and he knows my family name. And then I mentioned Emerson to him, and he says, Emerson. He knew Hafez. He really understood. And I'm like, you know Emerson. I couldn't believe this exchange. So it's always been with me. So I follow these trails like scholars do. I really believe almost like fatalistically, like we find the one my wife I was supposed to find, right? But also the poetry discoveries, even when I'm not planning it. So if you don't know about Walt Whitman, I mean, almost like Hafez for 19th century America, the American poet, just bigger than life, Leaves of Grass, just really understands the American culture, just keeps growing his poetry. And so he was devastated when the Civil War started in America because he loved America so much. He wants to unify it. He wants to see it in this whole, and it's tearing him apart. And he drops everything he's doing. His brother was in the Civil War fighting for the North, the Union Army, and gets hurt. So he goes to help his brother. It turns out, thank God, his brother wasn't that hurt. But he sees all of these young boys in the war, like 15, 16 years old, dying, limbs getting cut off. And he spends the rest of his life helping these people. I think as they're dying, writing their mothers, all of this. And then he had said in one of his notes, in one of his letters, he said, I have this book that I keep at the bottom of my trunk when I travel in the Civil War helping these boys. And it's Alger's Poetry of the East. And it has a lot of translations of Persian poetry and an extensive introduction, this scholar that came out in the mid-19th century. And he said, it's so Persian. He said, it's in my trunk, at the bottom of the trunk, I spilled some Virginia wine on the poetry manuscript. And if you know Sufi mysticism, this metaphor of wine,
Yeah.
and so I said, I have to find this book. This is a book that Whitman says he read to these dying men. He would sit around these Persian poets. What the heck? And I try to find it. Amazing, amazing.
Yeah.
This retired veterinarian in New York City, obsessed with Whitman, has bought all of his first editions, everything. And I write to the family. They said, we don't know where it is. I can't find it for 8 years. I look. And then he died, this veterinarian, and some of these collections went to the University of Virginia. I got a grant, and I just wanted to see this book that Whitman carried with these Persian, underlined in his handwriting, all of Atar, and I'm like, this is amazing. And I keep reading it, and I keep reading it, and they sound so familiar. And then suddenly I open the poetry collection Walt Whitman wrote, Drum Taps, about the 19th century Civil War. And I said, I have to connect these two. What's happening? This sounds so familiar when Whitman's writing this Attar poem. And I look, and he is actually imitating, and nobody has discovered this. It's just, I got chills when it came to me. One example, we all know Atar, the poetry, the Conference of the Birds in translation, right? The Simorg, where all of these birds are going to look for Sufi enlightenment, and, it turns out, of course, the Simorg, the 30 birds, it stands for in Persian. And it turns out all of these birds looking for the mythical bird, they themselves constitute it, is the big revelation. So Whitman takes that idea and he writes about himself being this bird, leaving Long Island, New York, and flying over all of America that's being broken up in Civil War.
Mhm.
And he tries, and he's seeing America as one holistic thing. So it's Attar influencing Whitman in the Civil War. You can't make this up. I published this article, and this has been almost, let's call it an accidental comparativist scholarly journey. It's like I didn't want to even find that. I didn't know what I was looking for, right? Emerson, the same thing. People told me, no, Emerson, he was interested in Persian poetry, but not like that. He's calling himself Attar. He said out of everybody in the whole world, he wants to be Hafez. He's translating through German sources, Hafez, Saadi, Attar, just amazing. It just keeps unfolding for me. So that's the scholarly journey. I feel like I know I'm supposed to talk, but I feel self-conscious. I already talked too much,
No, no, please. I loved it, and I'm sure, and I promise you that the audience will love it. It's fascinating. Honestly, I didn't know that like Persian poetry has been having so much influence on American literature until I came across your thoughts, your writings, and even we didn't know that. Like as an Iranian myself, I grew up in Iran until I was 25. Then I left Iran for education. I went to Turkey, and I've been like there for more than 10 years. But even as an Iranian with an interest and active involvement with Persian poetry, we don't know that there is this much connection between Persian and American literature. And I was fascinated to see that you are bringing that to light. And so it's truly amazing. And the stories that you gave, like put everything in perspective.
If it's one thing that gets the Iranian attention, it's poetry,
Right,
because there's such a deep tradition, right?
right.
And then, Americans have a different relationship with poetry. It's gone other places. It's not the deep-rooted sense it is in Iran. But when you say Walt Whitman or Emerson, like everybody kind of knows that. My American grandmother that grew up on this farm with a high school education, even she read, Walt Whitman, Emerson. He's like so foundational. So the idea that these two cultures, and of course now politically, tragically, never understanding each other. I think the
Right.
people do, it's the politics always, but it's this commonality. On the entrance to the United Nations, there's this great Sadi poem about everybody being the members of one body, and I think something like poetry, this
Right.
even for all of my cynical postmodernism, graduate school almost ruins you, because it makes you so cynical and you don't read
I
it, you
can't
stop
agree
enjoying the work because you're studying it all the time.
more.
But even me, I have to come back to being a humanist and say, like, can you believe that in the 19th century, out of all of the things to look at, that this foundational American figure is so interested and he knew something was here. And the one I don't want to marginalize, late 19th century into the 20th century, there's this American poet, female poet, Elsa Barker, and she's writing poetry. She's also a very good critic. And she hasn't found it like I did, but she's reading Walt Whitman and she said, there's more Persian here than people realize. And she couldn't pin it down like exactly, but there's something going on. And the same thing with Emerson. And now when I made these discoveries, I do give her credit that she was intuiting something was happening. Walt Whitman later in his life, he wrote this poem about the Persian poet, and it's this old Sufi mystic that gets, kind of seeing the bigger picture of it all, like that Sadi poem, we're all connected. And Whitman's growing a long beard, and I really see Whitman seeing himself in that poem of like, I'm this old, really lovely
Really?
kind of, if only we could have these conversations instead of the political,
Yeah.
conversations, it would be, I think, a better world,
For some reason, we don't hear such discussions. Like when we are, like I said before meeting you, I was really, I myself didn't think that there is this much connection. We say, okay, Persian poetry, we go on a certain direction. American poetry, American literature go in a different direction. How could they even be connected? But I came across you, and interestingly, there has been this Iranian scholar working on Ferdowsi's poetry and
Mhm.
his epic poetry, and the research will come out soon. But like the amount of influence that Ferdowsi has had internationally is unbelievable. People from Japan, poets,
Yeah.
literary critics have been like claiming, praising Ferdowsi for what he has done. Like they go to war and they take a copy of Ferdowsi's epic poetry with them to,
Yeah.
that is
Right.
unbelievable. Yeah, and that shows that poetry really helps transcend boundaries.
It really does. I gave a talk recently, and I think it just, I wasn't planning, but I was talking about this classical Persian poetry trope of, the moth dying in the flame, very Sufi, like for the beloved, but also what it means to live in God. And then Eric Clapton, right? Singing this famous Layla song from Layla and Majnun, but then also another song he talks about like loving this woman so much, kind of like a blues song, but for rock and roll, and like a moth to a flame, he says, and I'm like, it just keeps coming up in these different places, really. And of course, now Iranian film, just really like a new form of lyric poetry that's been an influence, but absolutely Ferdowsi, Attar, they influence culture in ways that I think we still haven't fully unpacked. I tell my half Iranian wife, like, I want my money back from some of these college classes because they really taught me in a very limited way, like even Whitman, they teach the young Whitman where he's very like cool and like the America's new and he's very positive. That's an important part of him, right? But they don't teach when he's getting older, interested in these Persian poets after treating thousands of dying soldiers, and ruminating on their lives and how it's changing him. As I get older, I kind of need that Whitman too, to think about a deeper journey, of life. But absolutely, I think there's a lot more comparative work that needs to be done. And I think it's like these conversations, even Emerson scholars that have lived their lives in Emerson. Before my book, we put out a transnational like Ferdowsi, a transnational study on Emerson of how China, Japan, how he's influenced respective cultures, how they write back to Emerson. And these Emerson scholars, very accomplished, they told me they had no idea Emerson's engagement with Iran, that he was actually looking so closely through these German sources. So I think it's important conversations, and I think it's important work that still needs to be done, you know?
It is. And I really appreciate the research you are doing and what like you're starting kind of a current that will open up the way for further research. Because like I said, I've spent all my life studying poetry. I did not know this, and I'm Iranian. That's embarrassing. So I hope this through this video, and I hope it's not going to be the first and last one, we get to introduce this new research area for young scholars so that they come in from both sides, both from the Persian tradition and from the American tradition, even not from the tradition, like international scholars studying these traditions.
Absolutely. And I think it's hard to discover because it's so good. You know, like poetry, it hides, you know, because it's so beautiful, you don't see the origins. In fact, when you do sometimes, if it's like in my creative writing classes, when you have students, like a very simple imitation isn't good because you're trying too hard to be this particular poet. But what ends up happening in all literary traditions is it transforms, you know? So it kind of like you still see Emerson or you still see Whitman, they're still their American poets, but then you see this influence coming into it, and it's very sly because they're good writers, you know? And I do think, you know, it's the same even in the to follow the Persian tradition backwards, like it's not like a one-to-one correspondence, right? Like you see Hafez picking up other sources, but he's still his own amazing transformative poet. I think there's a lot to be said, you know.
Right. Very interesting. Thank you very much for explaining all this. I'm so excited that I can barely control my emotions. So I'm trying to be quiet, but that's really, really
Oh
difficult.
my God, please, let's have a conversation. I'm so
yeah. So I'm such an amazing topic. So let's go to the second question. Why do you think that, like, first of all, what is the influence of literature, poetry, on both academic and public domains? And why do you think that young scholars should engage with this, I'm confidently calling, new research avenue?
the value maybe of like for one, I think, you know, the kind of conversations we're having, you know, and I also think, you know, creatively, um, it opens up more dialogue, it opens up more creative spaces. I can tell you anecdotally, right? So I teach a very diverse, one of the beautiful things of teaching specifically in New York, it's like students from all over. I think there's like 50 languages spoken on our college campus. In one given classroom, you know, we have students from Sudan next to somebody from Mexico, next to somebody from Iran, you know,
Very interesting.
really amazing. So I teach, you know, in the creative writing and in Masters of Fine Arts, master's students with creative writing and translation. But I also teach these American literature classes. And one of the most, and it's all the great things happen by accident, you know, great discoveries academically, creatively. So I'm doing this kind of work myself for years now. And when I start discovering these things about Emerson and Whitman, I bring them into my class. So ordinarily you would teach like a Walt Whitman poem, Emerson's essays and poetries. But I say, look, you know, let me show you what I'm doing to these students. And some students are Muslim, some students are from Iran or, you know, the trans-Arab world, and they're really leaning in, and they had no idea, like, wait a minute, you know, you're telling me that I have a cultural influence here. And more broadly, I'm far away from being like an Islamic scholar or, you know, but I have some familiarity growing up the way I did. And I start interjecting, like, you know, we always talk about the Christian tradition in 19th century American literature, because just like you can't understand somebody like Hafez without the Quran. Well, it's the same way. Unless you're really reading the Bible, you're not getting the influence, the core influence. But I said, wait just a minute, you know, America has this plurality of societies and influences. And you're also not understanding something if you don't really get the influence of Islam in some ways, like Emerson, for example. And one of the things completely unplanned that started happening is my students, those Muslim students, Iranian students, they were starting to get really interested. Like, wait a minute, I teach the ghazal, the form, in scholarly classes, also in my creative classes. They were like, wait, I know this, like I know this form. I grew up, even students from Urdu, right? So it opens up this
Beautiful.
bigger space. They're writing papers on, on this form, this engagement, the things that they're finding, even like in theory classes. What do you do with that lacuna, that space around which we just talk as scholars, but you can't really pin down because it's the mystery, right? Deconstructionists just say, well, what can you do? But I said, this is the beginning of religions, right? So I'm not afraid to have these conversations. There's this split in United States about religion supposed to be over there or God. I talked about God in Hafez's poetry at a conference at Duke University. It made people nervous. Like, oh, don't mention. I'm like, wait a minute. This is a reality for people. So
Oh,
it
not.
opens up a bigger space, and we're having these conversations. And I think it's a really great way to connect into things and to find out that literature is much more informed with different voices than we realize, just like my classroom. And I think that's a really good starting place. So to answer part of your question, I think that it is really, at least in the US, it's very topical now to have new discoveries. America gets especially bored very quickly. Like we were breaking the rhyme in like the 19th century. It took a while with somebody like, some modern poets like Nima in Iran, then that was a scandal in the 20th century. America keeps needing to do new things. And I'm like, we need new discoveries, new places to go. Why not look at this kind of new this new territory? There's unmined, and like you mentioned, Ferdowsi, this Atar, these kind of philosophers that are putting philosophy in poetry, and maybe that's an accessible way to look at something. So I think that's part of it.
Right. Beautiful. And that resonates also with me. I, before I was studying engineering, I studied mechanical engineering. Then I switched my field. I went to philosophy. I studied Western philosophy, but my heart was with Sufism, Islamic mysticism, poetry. I came to philosophy of religion, but my research areas is still in Persian poetry and Sufism, especially Ibn Arabi. Then continuing on this path, I said, okay, why not offer courses? I have been teaching quite recently Persian poetry courses, especially Rumi and Ibn Arabi courses. And I was shocked, really, to see how much interest from different traditions there are. In our Rumi course,
Mm.
there are people from Brazil, from India, from Pakistan, from United Kingdom, from America, from Iran, from Turkey. And I was like, wow, what is happening? While we were studying
Yeah.
Rumi's poetry, there is this fellow, this lady actually, who gives us like insight from Buddhism. And there are others giving us insights from other traditions. And I'm amazed how transcultural and deep
Yeah.
poetry, poetic traditions can become. And I will add one more thing, then I will try to make myself quiet again. In our Ibn Arabi studies, we are even shocked more. I have received more attention in my audience from Ibn Arabi compared more from Ibn Arabi than Rumi. And this is the guy who is hardcore into Islam. Of course, he respects other religions. He says, yes, you can find truth from other religions, but more from Islam. So he's quite strict. But there is his metaphysics resonates so much with other traditions that, again, there were
Oh,
people from many, many traditions, non-Muslims, people from secular people coming and reading Ibn Arabi. I'm amazed. I really am.
now you're talking, I'm not the even Al-Arabi scholar you are, but I'm fascinated. I read in translation and I love it. It's transformative for me. Probably Rumi remains one of the top at one point he was the top selling poet in the
Right.
United States. This is
Right.
Jalaluddin Rumi, right? So everybody, and to
Mm.
one example, I did in January, all of January, I went to this artist writers, it's prestigious, this McDowell, like where famous writers and artists go as like a residency.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to introduce my work, and it's not scholarly. So I was bringing my poetry self, which I know we're going to talk about. So I decided to do some of my own original writing, but I also work in Rumi and Atar and the lines, and they were couplets. They were Persian couplets from the ghazal. And so I'm introducing the form a little bit, which we definitely need to talk about because that changed American poetry in a lot of ways through somebody like Aga Shahid Ali. Just so all
Interesting.
Americans are this form now, and they're learning about it. Amazing with kind of ritual. And I gave everybody, it's very Persian. So, I put one couplet each inside of a pistachio. And I wanted to make it like a fortune cookie. This is my performance work, which I know we also will talk about. So
Mm.
I give them each one pistachio, one couplet from one ghazal. And if you know this Persian form, the beauty of it is they work independently. So one couplet itself is a poem. You don't need the rest of
Mm.
it, but you can have it. And then it was all mixed up of all of these different, this was Hafez. So all different. And then I had them each read this one translation and they go around the room and there was quiet. I'm not exaggerating. People were crying. And I'm like, what's going on? This was just some funny thing I was going to do. And what I realized is like, some people, I honor all religions if you have it and it works for you, but religion gets a bad name. A lot of people don't want the formality and the things that go with it, but there's still a spiritual hunger, a religious hunger. And I think that's what poetry always fills in different, maybe it's through a singer, maybe it's through rap like Kendrick Lamar for my students. There's something it's filling this void. But I think what you're talking about when you introduce Al-Arabi or Rumi, I really feel people. My sister was getting married years ago. I think her mother-in-law is watching or is going to watch this, so I shout out Hadel Brick for this. But they always ask me when friends I know, family are getting married, can I help them pick out poetry for their wedding? What's poetry for in America? For
Mm.
weddings, and funerals, right? So
Right.
so I said, okay, like I gave them, I really took my job seriously. I had like 50 different poems, my sister and my brother-in-law. And they're like, I read them this one, I read them this one. I read them a Rumi poem in translation and it was quiet. And I'm like, I look up, they're both crying. And I'm like, okay, we're gonna
Yeah,
do
Rumi
Rumi.
does
So I think it's this like go undergraduate, they come in the first day, they're like, oh, I hate poetry. I don't want to read poetry. I don't want to see. But they like this spiritual connection because it brings themselves, their soul to it. And I think that's the teachings of Ibn al-Arabi, Rumi, and whatnot. And I think that's the real primal need.
that. Right. Amazing. Yeah, Rumi does that. I totally understand. At nights, I have this like kind of a retreat, personal retreat. I go into the garden here and recite Rumi's poetry to myself. I meditate, and sometimes I come back to myself and I realize, oh my God, I'm crying, reciting Rumi's verses to myself, and there is nothing sad about it, and that is truly amazing. Nobody, no poet, not even Ibn Arabi, can get me um, as emotional as Rumi does. Emotion is not the right word, I know, but I don't want to sound too mystical. When I read Rumi's poetry, and it's like he's touching your heart, he's touching your soul, and it gets you into that atmosphere he wants to get you in to transform you there. And I think that's
Yeah.
one of the fascinating reasons why poetry is so, cross-cultural. Um, with philosophy, which I have spent a lot of time studying and reading, yeah, you can convince people. You can do that. You can get convinced, but I think you can convince people with two, three couplets more effective than writing 10 pages in prose alone.
Yeah,
And
I
I
think
have been
so.
fascinated why that is happening. And through my like research, there are lots of reasons I will be asking you, and you know more than I do. But the combination of reason, emotions, imagination, like everything comes into play, like everything is combined, and it becomes a multifaceted weapon for the poet to get you where he or she wants to get you, and to transform you, to influence you. And Rumi does that fascinatingly.
No, the great German romantic Rilke, he says you have to be willing to die for poetry. And that always used to scare me. Like, I don't want to be a martyr.
Yeah.
But what I come to understand, it's like, especially in over themselves,
Mm.
truly get over themselves. And their writing gets me into that place where I forget myself, and I just lose myself in this. I listen to the singers too, like this, like Shahram Nazeri, that sing the lines of Rumi, and it transports me to something that like really great. And like you said, that one couplet, Rumi has this that poem, it's translated so much about he's lost it all, everything, and he doesn't even know the way to his own house, to pour the wine, or even like Hafez talking about a broken winged bird somehow finds the eye of the hurricane, like in the middle of the storm, the bird. And when I'm in trauma and I'm going through so much in my life, yeah, it's like you're saying, it's not like 30 pages of something to figure my way out of it. It's some image like that, something. A younger person, when I did that Hafez performance, a younger person told me, she said, we need rituals now more than ever. We're
Mhm.
all so lost in our culture. And I'm like, what do you mean by rituals? Because I have my own definition. And she's like, not religion, but something like poetic rituals,
Mhm.
like where we ourselves are letting the poetry go through us. I think that's a very big difference than
Right,
a lecture or
right,
somebody like explaining why it's significant as opposed to letting it cycle through us.
right. Amazing. What you said reminded me of this couplet from Rumi, if my memory aids me. He says, گر شوم مشغول اشکال و جواب تشنگان را کی توانم داد آب. If I engage with like question and answer, with debate, with philosophy, reason, logic, I'm paraphrasing, I'm not directly translating. How and when would I
Yeah, yeah.
satiate the thirsty? There are many thirsty people. I'm not here to convince you. I'm here to make your thirst go away. I'm here to transform you. And that's powerful. That poetry there is just something that prose is not. Now, performance rituals. What kind of performance ritual are you interested in, Professor? And like I was getting into Sama dance, the whirling dance for dervishes in Mevlevi order, for example. People dance
Yeah.
like that. Like this is one poetic ritual. They were singing, Rumi's poetry while they were dancing like that. What kind of rituals do you see in poetry? What kind do you find fascinating, effective, and especially when it comes to Hafez?
Yeah, this is really, and I think if what I do with Persian poetry isn't always understood by my colleagues or the American tradition, especially performance, there's misunderstanding. And I think it's so important, in the tomb of Hafez, which I've had the great honor of visiting,
Amazing.
his lines are being sung on a loudspeaker,
Right.
So at Rumi, like you said,
Right.
even people that don't understand, they love to see the whirling.
Mm.
It intrigues them. They're attracted to it, the
Right.
voice. So there's the famous 20th century American poet, Robert Frost. He has this famous line about translation. Poetry is what gets lost in translation. I mean, I promise you, every
Right.
single translation conference,
Right.
every book, every day, everybody talks about that. So I think about you just gave us some Rumi in translation. I can do it, a little with Hafez or something, but there's always something like,
Mm.
Iranians will tell you, you don't understand. There's just
Right.
something, it won't carry over the same way. Even like my Spanish speaking students, one told me this before the semester ended, it's just different when I argue with my wife or my girlfriend or my mom. in English versus Spanish. There's
Right.
just some things there, you know.
Yeah.
And I think something performance tries to capture that getting lost. You know, Coleman Baronians judge him because he brought music to translation of Rumi. I think it's amazing because there's this background, there's something coming out when he reads the lines of Rumi with all of this music. You know, that's one example. What I was thinking about with this, again, with the rituals, what inside the poetry, meaning wise, where it's not just me as a reader of translation to the students or a lecturer of translation to my audience, but what could really get them in this collective experience? So one was making, it's a little gimmicky, I know, but making these fortune cookies with the verses of Hafez and just letting them honor each of their couplets. And I told them, just like Iranians in the divan, like the collected works of Hafez, to this day, if they want their fortune or there's something significant, they might open up his collective works and point at a couplet, and that will give them the revelation. So I tried to bring that idea that this is what Iranians do, you know? What if we try this? And this is your fortune. And they really, oh, and I didn't mention this. So we do this performance ritual. Some people are crying. Then some of the artists, the painters, when they're giving an exhibit, we go to their cabins in this artist residency and we see what their art is. They had their particular Hafez couplet on the bulletin board in the room where they're staying.
Right.
And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, this is my, and then we have this little ritual where we say goodbye to people at the end of the residency. And we give a speech and everybody cries, say bye. They would read their fortune. And I'm like, this is not me. This is something. And a better example. So Valentine's Day, it got a little popular in Iran. I think it's an excuse to buy something for somebody you love. It's
Right.
really big in America. I don't know if they do it in
Yeah,
Turkey,
yeah,
but
same here.
so Valentine's Day, February 14th. So I was giving a big translation reading with somebody that's a very famous German translator in New York City on Valentine's Day. And I said, you know, I don't just want to read Hafez. I want to do something. So there's this line. It's a very Sufi mystic line. You'll understand better than I will. So it's like to the lover, to somebody that's like in tune with God, what tastes the sour and the sweet taste the same to them. Meaning like you reject me or accept me. It doesn't matter. Why? Because I'm so plugged in with love, right? With God. It's like everything. So I took that line, and this is very complicated, but I'm going to try to make it simple. It's better in performance. Walter Benjamin, this famous, famous philosopher, wrote a very difficult essay about translation. Has to die and be born again, as a new in translation. And something, so I'm interested as a translator and as a Sufi mystic, poet, translator, of bringing that idea out. So what I did, I took those lines that to the mystic, to the beloved, the lover, the sour and the sweet taste the same, and I burned them, right? I burned the lines of Hafez in the original Persian. And then I take this ashes, right? And how am I going to make them reborn? Following Walter Benjamin. So I make and I put it in the batter. And then I bake this cookie and I decorate it. I get that's the thing. You have a lot of fun with performance, right?
Right.
So then I go to this audience, this reading, and then I say, we're going to have, it's in Christianity, they do this communion with Jesus' body, where everybody takes a little bit of the bread and you eat it. And that's like the body. So I said, let's have a little bit of Hafez, and I explained this, and I read the poem, I do other things with music, and then I go down and I make it very sacred. I put it on a tray, and everybody gets a little bit of Hafez, the sour and the sweet lines. And somebody, it's very interesting, actually gets the part with a lot of ashes, and they're like, oh, this is now, because you're special, I'll tell the bad the rejection story. I'm a very sensitive poet, right? So people are somebody in the back row turn to their like whoever they came with, and they said, this is kind of a little too silly. This is kind of stupid. And suddenly what happens to me? I'm just like in a class, you're a teacher, right? Everybody can be laughing, have a great time, but that one student that's like looking at their phone that doesn't care about you, you focus on that. So here I am having this moment, this performance moment. I was on National Public Radio that day. It was like a big moment for me, for America. And then I focus on that couple and what they said, and my feelings are hurt, right? And then I finish the performance and everything. And then I get my coffee, I say goodbye, and I'm driving home. And then suddenly I realize, wait a minute, that aid, the bitter and the sweet taste the same to the lover. I'm like, I missed my own lesson. Hafez is teaching me something. And I
Mm.
suddenly had this transformative, this is a mystic moment. This is 21st century mysticism. And I said, who am
Right.
I? Like, oh, I embarrassed myself. Why should I care what I look like? Right? This is about a bigger thing. And I say a little prayer for those people, and knows how it challenges them. Sometimes something challenges me, and my first reaction is dismissal or judgment, because that's what
Right.
human beings do. And then you work through it. How many trips I've taken when my sons were little, and they complained the whole time, oh, is it? And then we come home and they're like, this was an amazing trip. I had a great time. I'm like, wait. So long story short,
Yeah.
performance allows a space to bring people together, to challenge people. It's so cold. Emerson called it corpse cold Christianity in the 19th
Wow.
century, where everybody's just standing up eating the same thing in church, sitting down. He wanted poetry he wanted something to be alive, like a true experience, like a true
Mm.
transformative. He didn't know it, but what he was really saying is he wanted a mystical experience. He
Mm.
wanted Rumi, not the same dry text. And that's what music brings. I've used elements of dance, I've used food, and I like also, gets me in trouble with the American audience, but I myself got kind of bored with poetry readings. I'm a poet. I go all over the place reading, and it starts to feel like Emerson's church. Like, here's this. Here, why can't we engage like the audience? Why can't the audience? Why can't the? And I think that's much more what Ibn al-Arabi, this, like, we're all connected. It's this collective in the Garden of Iran in Shiraz, like on Friday. It's not my poem, your poem. It's let me say a couple lines, you say a couple lines, somebody else, and something else is bigger. It's the communal experience, the community
Right.
experience of poetry. Rumi does that.
Yeah. What you said reminded me of this. There is this scholar who has passed away, a modern philosopher in Tabriz, Iran, Allama Muhammad Taqi Ja'fari, who was a great philosopher, who wrote like 12 volumes for Rumi's Masnavi alone. He says,
Right.
I I wrote the fourth volume. I was on the fifth. One night I saw Rumi in my dream and was very excited. I went to him and talked to him, and I'm conscious that I have been writing that commentary. I said, I have written 4 volumes. What do you think about it? Do you like it? Is this what like do you think it is in the level of your poetry? Rumi looks back at him, like gazes at him, and he gives him this puzzled look, saying, "Why are you asking me? Ask God." And he says, I was shocked to my core. And reading this, like the same happens to me. I was like, oh my God, when I'm writing a paper, when I'm like putting together these pieces, creating this video, who am I doing it for? If I'm doing like Rumi's work, I should be having that intention as well. They sometimes give you something that changes your entire life. So what you said totally resonates with me.
That is so good. Oh, and the 1 minute story. So I'm a dinosaur. I still use Microsoft Word. Some people like they're using new formats, and I had these so many important files. My own poetry, my own next academic book on rituals and 19, and they all corrupted. And my wife is a guru with tech stuff. She said, "Don't worry, I can find it." She came upstairs after 3 days of work and she said, I'm so sorry, they're lost and you're not going to get them back. Just you have to accept it.
Oh.
This was, lost. My older son is Muslim, at 20 years old and reading things I
Really?
don't even know about. And he said, Dad, we're on the way and I'm like, you don't understand. I'm almost going to cry that this all, and I think it was Ghazali. I don't know who he was quoting. He's like, Dad, but he quoted a Sufi to me. He said, so and so, I think Ghazali said, it's yours. The really important thing is inside you, Dad.
Mm.
And I'm like, my God, don't hurt, I can't believe you're doing this to me. And he said, don't worry about it because
Right.
it's all here. And man, it was a very strange moment for me, but I love this story about the dream. My gosh, a deep truth. And I think we keep forgetting it. So we just keep having to bring it back to each other.
Professor, um, you are a poet. How did this start? How did you decide, if you decided to be a poet? What are the general themes in your poetry?
Very young, like, 6, 7 years old, I loved, I don't know why, making rhymes. I would write for my teacher, this Mrs. Stanford's grade. I would make my own poetry book, like sew it to their yarn and give it to her always. And my Iranian father, I think he encouraged it, which I'm very grateful for. He's passed away. He would give me
I'm so
Emerson
sorry
books,
to
by the
hear.
way. He liked Emerson too. And so I grew up writing it. I grew up writing it, and I became later in life, like, well, later, but in my 20s, more interested in the Persian tradition.
Mhm.
And I felt like a fraud because I grew up in America, more American culture, but all with Iranian relatives, always with the Iranian. And I started studying the language and the poetry, and almost with no it, fusing like because I thought that was original for me, that I'm taking this form that is writes in Rumi, translated from Persian, from Farsi, but I'm doing my own. And I think it's interesting. And then somebody like the Kashmiri poet, especially Agha Shahid Ali, he
Mhm.
introduces the form to America. So I got this scholarship to study. It's a prestigious place in Vermont, United States, breadloaf writers. And I'm going there, and as part of being on scholarship, you do a reading to everybody. And so one year I'm there in the summer, and all of these American poets saying, I'm reading my Ghazal. I'm like, wait a minute, you know about this form? How? And that, oh, from, shutting it. So what I think the difference for me is I really, as a hybrid Iranian American, one literary critic says, like, I put Wallace Stevens next to Rumi, or something. Like, I'm not planning it, but I'm trying to take the influence from this Persian culture. I still believe in the song of the poem, in Persian especially. There's one of the older ones, one of the older poets says, poetry is in the song. I want the musicality. But then I'm also corrupted as a 21st century American poet. You can't get away from that. And so bringing them both together, I think it's a very interesting entry point where it gets messy. And what's, I think, specifically about American poetry, as my Americanist background, it's always been wanting to pervert the form. Like Walt Whitman took Psalms from the Bible, Old Testament liturgy, religious liturgy, and he kind of takes it out and puts his own poetry in there. Emily Dickinson in the 19th century, these hymns that everybody stood up and sang, she wasn't so much about religion, but she would take that hymn form and write about her own nervous breakdowns, write about the flowers growing. And I think that Americanness that I grew up with really like influencing me, but then also this amazing tradition of the Persian and kind of bringing them together. And then you probably know, or your listeners probably know, or in case they don't, it's kind of subtle, but there's this Persian American Renaissance happening of it. But these younger poets, like Kaveh Akbar is like a rock star. He's like 21st century Walt Whitman. And, he doesn't set out to say, I'm this Iranian poet and I'm going to write in the American tradition, but I still see it in him as this diasporic hybrid poet. Solmaz Sharif, like, her family from Shiraz, like mine. And, we kind of came up together, even though I was older than her. And I think it's just kind of amazing. The essay I haven't written that I need to write, maybe for like Poetry Magazine in America, is like this 21st century Iranian invasion of American poetry, because it just doesn't go away
Right.
and it keeps transforming in different ways. Solmaz Sharif does politics so well. Kaveh Akbar is just absorbing something of this, the Sufi mysticism in his own work, however unintentional. And I just friends, but I'm a poet. I'm jealous because Kaveh Akbar has an agent. He's such a rock star, and I'm like, that Kaveh Akbar, he's getting so famous. Like I was doing that before him. And then I went to this
Right.
10,000 people at this American Writers Program conference, and I was really blowing up. My fourth book was doing really well. My performance character in English that I write under, and I was going to give this big reading performance. And I run into this guy, and he said, "Wait a minute, tall, lanky, with the beard, Kaveh Akbar." He's like, "You're Roger Sedarat?" And I'm like, "You're Kaveh Akbar?" And this is the
Wow.
gentleman, the Sufi that he is. He drops his bag and he takes out money. He's like, "I want to buy your book." And I'm like, "No, no, no, Kaveh, I want to give you my book." And he's like, "No, I want to buy your book." So we're fighting like this gentleman or whatever. And he's such a nice guy. He's just such a
Wow.
love bug. And he comes to my performance and he loves it, everything. And then when I get home, I'm waiting at the plane at the airport, I look at my phone and he had tweeted on the social media. He said, "The best thing about this whole conference, 10,000 people, Roger Sedarat's performance." And I'm like, God dang it. I can't even be jealous of this guy. He's just such a
Too
great
nice.
guy.
Too nice to be
But
jealous of.
there's a community
Mm.
of influence. There's a diasporic. It's happened. And the influence is not going away. It just keeps transforming in different ways. I think literary translation and I think the scholarship needs to catch up to it almost. That we
Mm.
can't lose it because
Right.
America just absorbs everything so quickly and so many things are happening. But we really have to, maybe as the scholarly side,
Mhm.
just kind of keep framing it and saying this is happening for a reason and it's happening from different origins. So I'm glad you and I are doing the promotive work.
I'm honored. I'm honored, and I hope this gets to be like a propeller for a new research avenue for many young scholars. I'm going
Same.
to ask you to please tell us more specifically about your work, your scholarly work, and then talk about, please, the role of novels in not only literary circles, but also in like teaching philosophy, teaching mysticism, teaching whatever ideology through novels. There are lots of people writing novels and then, especially in Persian, and trying to teach philosophy through novels. There are people from other traditions. Look at Brother Karamazov. The examples just go on. And do you think that is still the case? Can we have that influence on people through novels?
I wonder your thoughts on that too. I think so. I think that especially now, like Kaveh Akbar being the best example, right? This new novel he has is so hot. More people are probably going to read it beyond people are scared of poetry. It's a shame. I don't know if it's the same exactly in Turkey or Iran, but there's this kind of like, oh, it's too academic, or I'm not trained in a way, or something. And a good story goes a long way. Think about those spiritual allegories like The Alchemist, right? That just outsells almost anything in the past. So I do think that it going out to mainstream and then maybe even like it being turned into a Netflix series or whatnot. So the biggest change recently for me, I think you're really instructive for me because you started this podcast, this platform out of your own interest. And I know you can get very academic with it if you
Right.
talk deeply, but you also can reach a lot of people just like, Al-Arabi would do, right? Like, he doesn't want to just talk to this mic. That's what's so bad about academics. They draw such a tight circle and they just start talking to each other. And my pet peeve about poetry and academics, it's really a bad thing when poets start just writing their books for other poets, and those other poets review and they're interested. I want to reach other people. I play tennis. I learned late in life, tragically too late, but I wrote like a book of tennis poetry. And it's so nice being at like an academic thing or a creative writing conference. And then there's tennis players waiting to talk to me. It's, oh my God, so nice. And it's all connected. But, I wrote this tennis book of poetry. It's this young woman in my state of New Jersey in America. She's a 11th grader in high school, and she was assigned by her English teacher to write a report on a book of poetry. And her first thought, honestly, I hate poetry. I don't want to write. So she plays tennis. She's a top-ranked juniors national player, a top 100 player. So she Googles tennis and poetry, and my book came up. And so she reached out to me, can I interview you for this paper? She's from an Arab family, Muslim family. And I'm like, my God, we end up talking like this, about so many different things. She's asking me about the Persian references in my book of tennis poetry and stuff. And it made my day. And now I follow her and it's just wonderful. I think novels doing that more and more. A version of what you're doing, I started this like Substack, I call it jackass wisdom because, it's like to be wise, mystically wise, but in a making an ass out of yourself, a fool out of yourself kind of way. And so I take some Sufi stories and I kind of apply them to my own life. Why I thought I had a good idea is that when I was adapting old Sufi stories into things that have happened to me and making up some of my own, I would tell my wife. Now, my wife and I, my Iranian American wife, we've been together 30 years. So as soon as I tell her I want to read her a poem or tell her about something academic, she's like, please no, like, I just don't want to hear, because she's heard me for 30 years. So I say, no, let me tell you the story. And then the highest compliment, if you can get the praise from your wife of 30 years, she'll be, all of her good thoughts come to her in the shower in the morning. And then she comes downstairs and she said, that story you told me, I'm still thinking about it. And it really like this fight I'm having with my sister, like it really like it makes sense. So I start writing these accessible things, and more people like they write to me like the fan mail. So I did try. I'm not necessarily a fiction writer. I've written some stories that get published. I've been working on a novel that's like I'm pitching it to agents now. I've had a little bit of interest, but it's a Sufi mystic detective novel, and so like this. It's set in Iran. This scholar loses his job politically, whatever. And he has to solve the crime. But instead of like Sherlock Holmes through logic, it's through mystic revelation. So in fact, thinking gets in your way of solving. So the dream, and how could it fail, right? Because it's
Right.
these clues are like, Rumi's poetry, right? So, these kind of ruminations on, meditation is actually the answer as opposed to more investigation. And I enjoyed writing it so much. And part of the intention is, to trick people into enjoying this wonderful stuff. It's all there for you, but it needs to be repackaged sometimes. And sometimes, like, are my college students, my undergraduates, are they really going to read like the Princeton edition of something where there's 800 like pages of introduction and all of these footnotes and talk? They want that couplet you're talking about. They want that experience that brings you to tears, and they want it related to their own. And I like it taking different forms. I like when somebody can reach me in this more accessible way. And so I think that novels have done that for me, my wife. I don't want to be controversial, but some of like the really best-selling stuff that has leaned into the Middle Eastern, tradition, it's done really well. And I say, why not? Like some students have told me they love The Kite Runner. I'm like, okay, why not? You got exposed to something that, I'm not a old fuddy. I don't want to be that old where I'm like, oh, you don't understand. Like there's
Or not.
better,
They're
whatever.
they're
It
pretty
takes
young.
all kinds. And if you can reach somebody, wonderful, wonderful. Absolutely.
One thing I have been contemplating for some time now, academically and non-academically, is that how to influence the public, especially through social media or like contemporary media. Several answers come to mind. One through like videos, two through books and their recital. And I realized there is more audience when you're speaking than when you're writing. So I brought this podcast like to YouTube to help with that. Then I realized, well, many people just explain the literary aspects, or they get deep into Sufism, they deep into philosophical topics. I don't want to do that. There already works doing that. So I thought, how do I bring this to contemporary individuals' life? And I started like writing the scripts, writing, rewriting, throwing away, rewriting.
Mhm.
And I realized that if I bring the assumptions and implications that the authors were having in mind and hoping to have on the individuals, that would be more practical. So the podcasts I designed are more practical in that sense. To see, okay, Rumi said such and such, Shamsa Tabrizi said such and such. So what? What are the implications for our lives, for the contemporary individual's life? And what you said about that novel is just so exciting and rich for me, because I'm sure that's going to be doing the same thing in much higher levels. Speaking like bringing all the
No, this
medieval treasures to
so
contemporary. Yeah, please.
exactly that. And Emerson says, like, it has to go through you. It's a very romantic idea, but anything you teach, it's also very, very Sufi. Like anything you teach, if it's just from your knowledge, right? If it's not really your experience going through it. I mean, there was a senior seminar about the outlier in American culture I just finished. And this one student who got to trust us enough, she gave a great presentation about like the X-Men, this, kind of superhero, but she included the law, like 10 years ago, her brother being murdered, and she gave a deep talk connected to all the material. We were transformed. I told her afterwards, we're a different class after you trusted us enough, and shared that. So Emerson says it has to go through our own experience. Great if somebody else taught mystical things, but if you're not living that and practicing it or experiencing the results of it, Emerson says, man, or human beings, but man is only half himself, the other half his expression. It has to come out. And I think what you're doing, what I'm doing, I try now more than ever to tell my own stories with my students, to try like these Sufi mystics did. There's a friend in my town in a spiritual community. It's like a Sufi community. He's taken me to, they meditate and, this kind of thing. There's a teacher, a sect. But he tragically lost his son. His son was in college. He didn't know he had a heart condition. And just going on a run with his friend, his son just tragically died years ago. And he had this moment. He was starting to study Sufi mysticism, and there's this one line from one of the teachers where, oh, it's a famous story he tells better than me, but God tells this, mystic that I'm gonna kill you, and tomorrow or whatever, and he's rejoicing instead of being sad, and his friends are like, idiot, like why? And he says, that God even thinks of me, that I'm even included. And something happened. He was very depressed for a long time, mourning his son. Of course, he still has sad feelings, but he was going to a CVS, just shopping, and those lines hit him, and he suddenly forgot himself, everything. And there was this moment of like clarity you can't explain. And so other Sufi scholars have written about my friend, and it's just amazing. And he's the one that really, I knew about a lot of it before, but he's the one. I told him I was interested. He showed up, these many books, he's like, you have to read these. I'm like, okay, and I think my point is your point. It's that how is it if it's transforming you so much that you want to pass it on somehow to your listeners and your readers, And I think, my own spiritual practice. I was born for many reasons, but one, I think, to raise my family, everything. But how can I do this as a teacher? How can I do this as a creative person? We have these different platforms. What can I do to bring this to people? And I think as long as I put that up front, my mother has a friend that's going through a very hard time. And she said, I'm very self-conscious
Sorry to hear.
about this Substack, particularly to title it Jackass Wisdom and to make it like just two paragraphs. Like, and this, you probably have this too, where like people tell me, my friends are like, oh, I'm reading your writing. I'm like, that's not my real writing. My real writing are these books I'm publishing, and they're labeling me as this campy, like, don't judge me for that. But then my mom, her friend's going through this hard time. She's in her 70s. And she said, every week she looks forward to one of your posts. She gets so much, peace from it and
No.
what are we doing here if not this, right? And I love, Rasoul, your mission statement of wanting to take what you're inherited from these mystics, from Rumi, when you read and you don't even know why you're crying, and you wanting that to emanate through you.
Mm.
Like more than anything, I want like what Shahram Nazeri singing Rumi's lines does to me. I want to somehow emanate that, and maybe this is part of it, and maybe it doesn't have to be one thing. It can be, we can talk as scholars to each other. We can talk as creative poets to each other, as fellow human beings to each other. And it can have these different circles that are maybe all connected. It's like Rasoul, you need to be like a Persian mystic Zizek, like Slavoj Zizek, but for this, where it's like philosophy, really bold claims and a little controversial, all of this, and like we're tuning in and how to apply it to other things.
Right. Like I said, there are these great giant thinkers writing, composing poetry, writing philosophy. And then, okay, let's write about it. Let's speak about it. If you write, only the academics will read. If you speak about it, only the academics will listen. So how do we bring it to more like people's attention? And so their literature, like what you are doing, through novels especially, through poetry, is doing a great, great job. And on the other side, videos are doing a great, great job. We are from a culture, we are trying to make that culture known to another culture without that foundation. And then we are not doing it through prose, we are doing it through poetry. And there is this heavy reliance on symbolism. Read Rumi, he talks about, I don't know, wine, he talks about moon. Is he really talking about wine? Is he really talking about moon? No, like there's lots of heavy symbols
Yeah.
going on there. So how do we transfer this without people misunderstanding? And yeah, maybe we could bring that into an academic research as well, but not the concern of this video.
No,
Uh,
I like that. And I think my problem as an academic, I'm grateful for my wife because she's not an academic. And like when I was writing these posts for Jackass Wisdom in the beginning, she told me, to be honest, after 3 lines, I'm scared and I don't want to read it. She's like, make it so simple. And I'm like, no, but there's so much to say. She's like, it's
right,
too much,
right.
like the clip, right? The one thing, like we're such a my students are in such a TikTok generation. How do you take like all of the things we're interested in and TikTok it? There must be more of a conversation. I love this topic. We need to definitely keep thinking about it and keep working on it.
Of course. I'm really excited. I'm really happy that you like the topic. Professor, thank you very much. I know I have taken a lot of your time and I'm
No, this has
very busy.
really been an honor. This is, even if you didn't have this podcast, I would selfishly want to have this conversation I just had with you. It's so nice. I
Here.
think it's very important, very important.
Thank you very much, Professor. I really appreciate it.
Thank you
It's
so much.
a very
Thank you.
informative talk, and I'm sure my audience will love it. And I hope we get you
So glad.
again in this, we host you again in this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much.